Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first colloquium on race, race, equity, and social justice for the 21-22 academic year. I'm Bonnie Thornton Dill. I'm Dean of the College and Professor in the Harriet Tubman Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. So some of you may remember that this series was launched last year in 2020 as part of the college's broader initiative on race, equity, and social justice, developed around the goal of understanding and dismantling structural racism. The broader initiative includes transforming curriculum, reducing discrimination in teaching, research, and service, and expanding the impact of RHU's long-standing and continuing scholarship on racism, anti-racism, equity, and justice. And also consistent with President Pine's focus on racial justice and identity, we're pleased to welcome students participating with us as part of the Terrapin Strong onboarding program. In RHU, part of our approach is to offer opportunities for our students to be exposed to the many different ways faculty in the college study and teach about these issues. So I've had the pleasure of inviting and chatting with faculty experts from across RU to discuss their scholarship and creative projects related to anti-racism and social justice. And this year, we continue these conversations with a focus on the impacts of systemic racism on Asian, Jewish, Black, LGBTQ, and Arab and Muslim populations in the US. So the format for each session is the same. It includes a brief presentation by our faculty guest, and that's followed by a conversation with me, and then an opportunity for you to ask questions. We ask that your microphones remain on mute. During the last 15 minutes, you will be invited to submit questions through the chat, which is being moderated by Associate Dean Patrick Warfield, who will manage the question and answers. Please note, this event is being recorded for future viewing on RHU's website. So today I'm really excited to feature Dr. Christopher Bonner. He's Associate Professor in the Department of History. Dr. Bonner's work has appeared in the collections New Perspectives on the Black Intellectual Tradition and Emancipations, Reconstructions, and Revolutions. You can also find his stimulating essays online at Muster, the blog of the Journal of the Civil War, and at Black Perspectives, the blog for the African American Intellectual History Society. His remarkable book, Remaking the Republic, Black Politics and the Creation of American Citizenship, which he will be discussing today, recently won the Society for Historians of the Early American Republics Broussard Award for the best first book by an emerging scholar, a distinguished award showing yet again how RHU's faculty are redefining how we understand systemic racism in American history. So today, Professor Bonner will discuss Willis Hodges' Shield, the meanings of Black voters, a very timely topic. So please join me in welcoming Professor Christopher Bonner. Chris.
Thank you, Bonnie. I should have known to come here for a really great introduction. I'm glad to be here. I'm really happy to be a part of this series, and I'm looking forward to talking with you and to hearing from y'all in the audience with your questions and comments. So thank you for getting up early and coming out to hear about this. So I will share my screen, I think. Let me just navigate my. Yep. There we go. I'm going to share my screen and I'll talk for the next 10 minutes or so. What I'll do is tell a story from my book, Remaking the Republic. It's a story about one Black person, one Black man, and really about the work that he did to secure the vote. In his adolescent years, Willis Augustus Hodges must have spent many evenings with a sense of foreboding. worried about the violence that might be visited upon his family once he fell asleep. Hodges was born to free African-American parents in 1815 in Princess Anne County, Virginia, near the state's Atlantic coast and just above the North Carolina border. In the late 1820s and early 1830s, Black people in that area endured waves of violent attacks as white bandits invaded homes, assaulted people, and shot livestock. Willis Hodges later reflected on this campaign of terror. No free person of color within their reach was safe in person or property, he wrote, for these wolves had tasted human blood and liked it too well to let it alone. Hodges' parents owned about 200 acres of land, and they insisted on remaining in Virginia. But Willis looked elsewhere in search of home. He moved to New York City, and over the next 2 decades, he organized protest meetings, participated in political conventions, and wrote for Black newspapers. Eventually, he moved upstate, where he was elected to local office. The terror inflicted on families like the Hodges was intended to make the United States a white man's republic. Hodges spent the next decades contesting that vision of his native country and working to change the legal terms of his life. Hodges' story reflects Black American struggles to enrich their freedom in the early United States. In the aftermath of the American Revolution, several northern states passed laws that gradually abolished slavery. But at the same time, lawmakers in those states limited Black freedom in profound ways. So you're seeing here a piece of the Gradual Abolition Act from New York. But in New York in 1821, so 2 decades after this abolition process begins, in 1821, New York ratified a new state convention, a new state constitution that allowed Black men to vote only if they owned $250 worth of real estate. Essentially, a person had to be a property owner to vote. Most Black New Yorkers lived in the city and rented their homes, so most Black New Yorkers could not vote. Faced with these restrictions, Black people turned to citizenship in pursuit of justice. The word citizen appeared 11 times in the original US Constitution, so the document suggested that citizenship was important, but it didn't name the rights or obligations of the status. It also didn't say who could be a citizen. And this uncertainty was powerful for Black activists. No law said African Americans could not be citizens, so Black people insisted that they were, and they demanded legal protections under the status. Citizenship was a flexible and potent tool for Black activists. And when they claimed rights as citizens, they contributed to larger ongoing conversations about the relationships among individuals and the government. So this is the process I refer to in the book's title. Black folks were remaking the Republic. They were doing work that could change the foundations of US law. When Willis Hodges arrived in New York in 1833, he was disappointed at the state of Black freedom in the North. He was surprised to see that most Black New Yorkers struggled to support themselves with work as waiters, cooks, or dock workers. He must have realized that the restriction of Black voting rights was part of a broader prejudice that constrained Black life in the state. Eventually, though, Hodges did find stable work, and within a few years, he had saved enough money to open a small grocery store with one of his brothers who had left Virginia and joined him in the North. As Hodges came to understand the legal and economic marginalization of Black New Yorkers, he took up the work of trying to reshape Black freedom in the state. He immersed himself in a culture of Black protest. In 1840, Hodges represented his neighbors from Brooklyn at a Black state convention held in Albany, and I've got his name marked there with a little black star. The Black conventions were meetings that took place across the North beginning in the 1830s. African Americans gathered and they talked together about the problems they faced, and then they tried to agree on public statements they could make and other strategies that they could adopt in pursuit of change. This Albany Convention publicized a forceful critique of the property requirement for Black voting. They denounced the state constitution, calling it a violation of justice because it deprives us of those rights which should be enjoyed in common by all native-born citizens. Hodges also attended a Black convention in 1841, and there he outlined a new set of ideas about a different Black future. He urged Black people to adopt an agrarian lifestyle. If Black New Yorkers moved upstate and acquired affordable land of their own, they might be freed from the economic struggles of the city, and they could have access to a wide variety of new opportunities. Hodges and others believed that by moving west and helping to develop new communities, Black people might influence local laws and move segments of the country toward an embrace of racial equality. So Hodges was part of a broader field, I guess, of Black activism that focused on the West, broadly defined, going to places outside of cities, adopting lives as farmers, and using that work to try to reshape not only themselves, but to reshape broader communities. In 1847, Willis Hodges put this vision into action. He helped organize the New York Emigration Association, a group planning to establish a Black settlement upstate. He was convinced that action was necessary. He said, something besides speechifying had to be done if we wanted our rights. After a series of meetings of the Emigration Association, Hodges joined with 8 other Black families, left Brooklyn, and settled on 40 acres in the Adirondacks in 1848. These Black folks made their homes on land provided by the wealthy white abolitionist Gerrit Smith. Smith offered 3,000 Black New Yorkers land upstate, hoping that his land grants would make it possible for more African-American men to vote, and that their communities might convince white people that slavery was unjust. Any Black person between the ages of 21 and 60 who did not already own land and was not, this is from the record, was not a drunkard, would be eligible for a 40 to 60 acre plot. Gerrit Smith expressed serious concerns about drinking among Black New Yorkers. I'm grieved to learn that intemperance has made such havoc among the colored people of this state, he wrote. Vain and worse than vain will be my grant of land to a drunkard. Black recruiters who were seeking settlers to the Smith lands lied to their readers. The grant to you is free, untrammeled, unconditional, they wrote, but the grant was not unconditional. Gerrit Smith was looking for a particular type of settler. Smith's land grants implied that the right to vote should be available only to certain Black people, those who followed a specific, narrow moral path. Willis Hodges apparently fit the bill. He made his home in Franklin County, and while he lived there, he was elected to the position of town collector. I'm not exactly sure what his role was in that position, but I think it's an incredible turn in his story. Winning this election offered a direct form of government involvement, and it affirmed Hodges' legal position in the state and in the nation. Settling on the Smith lands put him in that position. So Hodges' story is a striking reflection of Black politics in action during the 19th century. He embodied ideas about the significance of formal political power and the avenues Black people should travel to attain it. In Franklin County, Hodges challenged the belief that the United States was a country intended to be ruled by white men. But while Hodges illuminates the legal possibilities of Black life in the 19th century, it's important to keep in mind how rare his experience was. He was born to free parents who were able to provide a basic education, which was not a typical experience for Black Southern children. He also had enough disposable income to relocate to New York and then to move again upstate in search of political influence. Those rare opportunities made it possible for Hodges to gain the formal political voice that Black activists had worked so long to cultivate. In this light, I think it's important to see that what Hodges won was a contingent citizenship. The status he attained in Franklin County was not available equally to African Americans. Black people made arguments about the terms of citizenship as they struggled to secure rights, but their arguments were often constrained by the idea that people needed to prove themselves worthy of rights. Jumping the high hurdle that the state erected on the path to Black voting did not confront the racial inequality at the heart of the law. Instead, when Hodges moved to the Adirondacks and renounced all intoxicating beverages, he assumed the burden of his Blackness. He urged other African Americans to do the same, to navigate the world under the legal weight of racism. And so to me, part of what Hodges' life illuminates are some of the critical differences between legal protection and liberation. So as I move toward close here, I'd like to say a few broader things about voting rights, voting and justice. One of the things I've tried to do in my work is to highlight the limits of formal legal change, even in moments where there were radical transformations. The Civil War era is one of those moments. In the Civil War era, African Americans found immense new opportunities to make their voices heard by people in positions of power. Black men insisted that their military service entitled them to the vote. They had risked their lives and killed rebel Southerners to defend the Union, and so they must be seen as deserving of equal political rights. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, said that race, color, or previous condition of servitude could not be used to deny a citizen the right to vote. But the amendment's limits were made clear in the racist violence that white Southerners practiced in their efforts to restore a white supremacist order. In 1873, in Colfax, Louisiana, a group of well-armed, organized white men killed more than 100 Black people after a contested election for governor. White Southerners across the South used similar tactics to suppress Black voting for decades afterward. The story of Black people struggling for suffrage has to acknowledge that historically, the formal right to vote has been at best a partial solution to the problem of inequality. But with that said, voting is critical. And Willis Hodges' story reflects the intensity with which Black people have pursued the vote across US history. It reflects the high barriers that have stood in their way. And it also reflects the potential people have seen in this political tool. In 1866, a group of Black New Yorkers said this: "To every man, the ballot is his protection from oppression and wrong, and his shield from the contempt of his fellow men." Perhaps it's helpful to see the vote in this way, as a shield, a way for vulnerable people to defend themselves against the most harmful manifestations of oppression. On its own, this is not enough to secure justice, but it's also not a tool to be discarded or neglected. Voting offers a chance to be heard in some of the spaces where white supremacy and economic inequality and so many other justices continue to be constructed. Perhaps with our voices in those spaces, those injustices might begin to be dismantled. All right, so thank you all for, again, for listening, and I will stop there and look forward to talking with Bonnie and hearing from some of y'all. I'll stop sharing my screen too, I think. Yeah.
Wow, Chris, thank you very much. As I said just briefly in the introduction, this is very timely, and I think it was. I'm interested in your parallels or things you might want to elaborate on. You talk about kind of the Civil War era as kind of producing certain opportunities and self assurance and rights and opportunities for Black people. And then we're kind of on the, and then on the backside of that, what happened? And now we're on the backside in some ways of the civil rights era. So from the Civil War era to the civil rights era. And as you look at parallels, and certainly there were a number of things that you suggested in your talk, but I'm just interested in kind of how you see today and the struggle over voting rights and citizenship, how you see that in light of and informed by this past. If you'd say a little more about it, because you've already said some things.
Yeah, there's a lot there to potentially tackle. I guess one of the things that I'm thinking about is one of the things that I think is an important parallel and something that I often talk about when it's like, you know, what lessons can we take away from this politics is the power of networks of communication and organizing that were deployed in the antebellum period. So as much as I like to make the point that what Hodges was doing was a kind of politics that required certain kinds of privilege, I also think that it's important that Hodges was involved in politics of collectivity. He was chosen to go to the Black Convention in Albany in 1840 and then another in 1841, but he was doing that with the idea that he would represent Brooklyn, that he would represent Williamsburg, where there was a substantial Black community. He organized, he didn't just say, I'm gonna jump to upstate New York and settle on the Smith lands. He was doing that as part of this New York Immigration Association. He did it with a group of other of families. And so I think Hodges understood, and other Black folks understood, as we should now, that politics works better together, and that the political ideas of well-known, and Hodges isn't even that well-known, but he was more well-known than many others in 1840 and 1848. Those people's politics should be informed by the concerns and interests of other folks. And so the idea of a Black person representing a broader Black community is really important. And one of the other things one of the other lessons, I think, is understanding how Hodges was able to sort of build those networks of how Hodges was able to become informed. Communication, the ways that people talked with one another were important. And so the Black conventions were these meetings that were held, in Albany. Most Black folks aren't going to be able to get to Albany to go to this convention, but the convention publishes its records and sort of creates a space for conversation. I showed images from Samuel Cornish's newspaper, The Colored American. Again, a kind of elite form. Cornish is a minister, a well-educated, a newspaper publisher, but the newspaper itself creates the field for conversation among Black folks and Black communities. I guess the last thing I'll say briefly in terms of in terms of parallels, in a lot of ways, the political crises of slavery, surrounding slavery, gave currency to the things Black people were saying. If free Black people are demanding rights, that's potentially really meaningful for enslaved people who might want to be free and then would want to demand rights. That's therefore nerve-wracking for slave owners and for white Southerners who are invested in slavery. And so the antebellum period, because of the crises over slavery, was an opportunity for Black politics. In the same way, Reconstruction was made an opportunity for Black politics because Black folks were out there expressing their concerns. And the fundamental question of Reconstruction was, what do we do with, we being the United States, what do we do with these 4 million people who have been enslaved and are now freed? So one of the things that I think is interesting is seeing how Black folks have created and tried to capitalize on particular moments. For many reasons, the murder of George Floyd last summer was that just last summer? Last summer was or became a moment when a lot of folks in the US seem to care about problems of racism and racial injustice. And so I think this is a parallel, right? We might think about the particular opportunities this moment presents, the fact that the University of Maryland has decided finally that Juneteenth is a day that should be observed. Thinking about that is maybe generative to see, like, all right, what else can we do in this moment?
Yeah, I'm really glad you talked about networks of communication and the importance of networks. I mean, in one of the other essays of yours that I read, you tell this incredible story about, but multiple stories. I mean, you feature one story, but you make it clear that there are these other incidents where free Blacks have been chased by people who are trying to return them to slavery. And they've been put in jail, and when they come out, or they're in the courtroom or something like that, all of these people, kind of nameless crowds of Black people come and fight off the police. They don't let them arrest him. They scurry the people away, so that they're these kind of individual characters, but there's this mass of Black people who suddenly appear, to the surprise. I mean, you talk about that case in New York, and since I worked near City Hall, I can just see that area of this man kind of, they're saying, well, they're going to put him back in jail because, they don't know whether he should be returned to slavery or not. And he comes out and there are 1,000 people out there who, start beating off the police and helping him escape. So I think that, that story kind of, and that connection about networks and the importance of networks. I don't know if you want to say more about that in terms of Black Lives Matter today and then, and anyway.
This is important. And that story, that's actually, like you're saying, you work near City Hall. Like that was one of my favorite research moments. And it was not like super hard research, but discovering that City Hall is the same building that it was in 1837 when this happened. And so when I found that out, I jumped on the train and went to New York and walked around, and it happened to be just like a beautiful, cold, clear day. And there's a picture that I took is in the book. But it's like you can stand on this plaza where, the newspaper records say 1,000 Black folks gathered and fought off the sheriffs, and really overwhelmed. The story is that there's this alleged fugitive being led out of City Hall, which was serving as the courthouse, and he's just flanked by 2 sheriffs. And they walk outside, and there's 1,000 Black folks out there. And it's like, what are these sheriffs supposed to do? It's almost overkill, kind of imagining how many folks came out. But the communication there, it's not clear exactly how those people came together. But one newspaper suggests and really criticizes another newspaper editor for publishing a message that said something like, we should always have crowds present to witness these trials of alleged fugitives. Basically, there's a report that a Black newspaper editor was saying, show up, make yourselves known, and try to secure justice. Maybe that meant steal this person and help them escape. Maybe that meant stand there and make sure people in power know that if they do something wrong, you will be heard. You will make yourselves heard. But so there's another way to think about like newspapers as really important political tools, not just for expression, but for constructing political communities. But I also think that the other point that you made, that so the story of William Dixon in New York, that's one of many. And there are famous examples of people like Jerry and the Christiana Pennsylvania War in the 1850s. I tell another story from the late 1840s. I think that the reason why there are so many of these moments is that folks understand that, or folks hope at least, that if I come out and show up in defense of someone like William Dixon, maybe William Dixon will do the same for me next month. The threat of kidnapping, the threat of arrest, whether you actually are a fugitive slave or whether you're a free Black person, that threat was pervasive. Any Black person in the North was vulnerable because enslaved people were valuable, and because the law of the country said that slave owners had a right to pursue fugitive slaves outside of the South. And so if any Black person is vulnerable, that might have put people in a position to feel like it really matters that I show up and help this person in the hope that they will do the same because I could be in that person's position. And so, I think that there's something, we could think about that as one of the, another kind of parallel, that sense of, that feeling of pervasive vulnerability. Nothing protects me as a history professor from the threat of police violence. Nothing protects me as a Black person of privilege from the various other perils that Black people face walking the streets. And so I think that that understanding of um, the breadth of vulnerability, I think can be really important to building that kind of political solidarity. And it's unfortunate, and I think there's much more to the sort of construction of these political solidarities than that. But I think that that's an important dimension of what makes people feel like I should show up for my neighbor because I might need them to show up for me.
Mhm. So one of the things you do is you take what we have often labeled activism
Mm,
and you talk about it in the context of kind of an intellectual project.
mm,
And so when you're talking about remaking the nation and citizenship, I mean, I think there's a lot here, at least that I hear, in terms of these networks of communication, various kinds of social activism, witnessing, and it is, so you're an intellectual historian. But I mean, but it's interesting because I think that we've often seen a break between those things. And so I'm interested in your coming to that approach.
yeah. I don't know. I think that when I was in grad school, I think there was part of me that embraced the idea of intellectual history because I was interested in people. Like I don't know if you can see, like I've got a stack of like various Frederick Douglass biographies or autobiographies on the shelf behind me. Like, you know, I was drawn to people like Samuel Cornish, the editor of this Black newspaper, like Frederick Douglass, people who were Black people who wrote and talked a lot. And that's like the very traditional sense of like, what is an intellectual, right? What is a Black intellectual? So I was drawn to that. And then I kind of became a little disillusioned also while I was in grad school because I wanted to try to think more about the people who weren't able to write and talk a lot, whose voices weren't recorded in the text so much. And so I was like, oh, you know, maybe I don't want to be presented as an intellectual historian because I don't want people to think like I only care about the elite and I'm only interested in the educated, the folks who were able to have their voices left behind for me as a historian. But I actually think that connecting with, and you mentioned the blog of the African American Intellectual History Society, the AAIHS, which is a great blog. I think it's blackperspectives.org is the address for that. One of the things that connecting with that group helped me see and helped me understand was that as one of the sort of originators of the group frames it, Black intellectual history is a history of Black thought and culture, how people are thinking, what people are valuing. And when we think about intellectual history that way, it helps us see, one, that we need to include more people within our understanding of intellectual history, and two, that, you know, a lot of people are thinking, are doing intellectual work. And so it really gives us a way of, it breaks down this image of, or it challenges any image of an intellectual history that is only the purview of Frederick Douglass. And it also urges us to see that Black folks are thinking. And you know, to take that example of William Dixon's rescue, the Black newspaper editor Samuel Cornish criticizes the mob. He calls them, I call them a mob, he calls them a mob. He criticizes the 1,000 people who go out and show up and calls them the thoughtless part of our colored citizens. He says, y'all are distracting from the legal effort to defend William Dixon. When you go out there and create this ruckus, you are being thoughtless. But I argue, and I think it's important to see that those folks are thinking. They're thinking, this could happen to me. They're thinking, I want to help defend this person. They're thinking the legal system that makes it possible for William Dixon to be seized off the streets and brought to jail and potentially sent into slavery, they're thinking that that's horrifically unjust and that they want to make a statement challenging that legal system. And so when we see that, we can see when we see that those folks were thinking, we can see the breadth of political conversation, political debate, political contest, in some cases within Black communities. And we can see how many Black folks were doing critical intellectual work to try to reimagine the nation in which they lived. So yeah, that's a really cool question. I don't know that I thought about that long trajectory of like what intellectual history has meant to me, but it's Black folks thinking is a really important subject, and a really broad subject.
Yeah, that's important to know. So Patrick, you need to let me know when I need to stop, because I could go on and on and on. And I do want to ask one more question if I have time for that before we open to the audience. So.
Absolutely. Yes, please.
Okay. All right, great. So I want you to talk a little bit about your teaching. And we do invite undergraduates to watch these or whatever, and how your research and scholarship affects your teaching. And you know, what you teach courses on African-American politics and culture, slavery and emancipation. So how does this inform your teaching, and how do you approach this? And I must say, I'm particularly interested because one time I was coming into the building and I walked by this classroom where C-SPAN was taping your class. And so I was like, oh, I want to be there. So anyway, talk a little bit about that. I
thought you were going to say you walked by and you heard somebody yelling. I think
especially
when I'm teaching now with a mask on, I'm always worried that I'm shouting. But I guess it is what it is. But no, I think that, so one thing that's kind of funny is that I still have a hard time teaching like directly on the stuff that my book is about. And I don't know if it's just because like my understanding of it is so esoteric that I kind of, you know, miss the forest, like the big picture stuff that I should be conveying. But I do think so. I'm still working on that, like how to teach Black freedom in the North to undergrads, how to teach Black politics without getting too much in the weeds or expecting them to follow me down into those weeds. But one of the things that I think does work or does connect between my teaching and my research is, you know, I've mentioned. I told Willis Hodges' story. We talked about William Dixon's story. I talked about Frederick Douglass. Like, I really like trying to bring people and stories into my students and try to give them, you know, like individuals to grab onto, and then use those individuals to think about bigger picture questions. And so, you know, one of the things that I'm actually sort of trying to work on a new project about a man named Moses Grandy, who was enslaved and tried and struggled to purchase his freedom. And Grandy eventually does get free. But one of the things that he says, he ends up writing a narrative of his experience. And one of the things he says at the or toward the end of that saga is, slavery will teach any man to be glad when he gets freedom. And I think there's something really powerful in that juxtaposition that, you know, Grandy, I won't say only, but Grandy appreciates his freedom in a particular way because he was denied it, because he was enslaved. And the point that I teach this with my undergrads and try to emphasize for them, you know, one of the bigger themes of the course when I teach the African American History Survey, everything from the beginnings of the slave trade in West Africa through Reconstruction in North America. One of the things that I try to teach them is about the duality of African American history, that the essential intertwining of the horrific things that were done to Black people and the lives of Black people within those horrific circumstances, that we can't understand one without the other, that we need to sort of always keep in mind both. And I think that piece from Grandy really conveys that Grandy was at once a person who had been enslaved and was free. And both of those facts, you know, we can't understand him without understanding both of those things about him. And both of those things sort of informed one another. His feeling of freedom, his pursuit of freedom was born out of his enslavement. And so there's a way in which I think that really captures this this connection between the very different kinds of experiences Black people had, and this is in the 19th century in the U.S. So yeah, I don't know. There's something really useful. You know, I latch on to stories to try to convey historical realities. There's yeah, I'll stop there for now.
Okay, so I have to ask you this question. Where do women figure in your stories?
Yeah, that's so I was gonna offer another example. So I'll offer an example from something I teach, and then maybe an example from the book as well. One of the things that I've started teaching and really enjoyed teaching in recent years is a letter that a Black woman named Hannah Johnson wrote to Abraham Lincoln in 1863, I think. And Hannah Johnson was the mother of a Black soldier who was fighting for the Union. And Johnson essentially makes a series of demands and says, you should make sure that my son and other Black soldiers are being treated equally. You should make sure that they're paid well. You should try to keep them safe. And so it's these things. And one of the things that I try to tell my students is that it's like, these are wild demands, right? Like Lincoln cannot keep a Black soldier safe. This is one of the perils of a war for freedom. But what's important is that Hannah Johnson and other Black women and men in this moment expected that the government would hear their concerns and listen to them. Like, it's wild that Hannah Johnson wrote that letter, but she wrote that letter because of a sense that the government should and must care about Black people in the Civil War era. And I think for Hannah Johnson, the fact that her son had enlisted was meaningful to her because he was offering service to the government and she should reap benefits from that. And so, you know, the story of the Civil War era is a story for Black people. It's a story in which, you know, Black men are able to enlist to fight. Black women take part in a lot of robust and extensive military service, and Black women and men together make claims on the government. They demand response. And so, you know, that story can't be told only about men, even though men were the ones who were enlisting and taking up arms. It's not a man's fight. And, you know, the story from the book that I think highlights this, something similar, that story of William Dixon. I suspect you'd sort of notice this moment that at the front of the mob, these 1,000 Black New Yorkers who come to protect this alleged fugitive slave, at the front of this crowd, the newspaper describes a Black woman who reaches under her dress and pulls out a knife and hands it to William Dixon in order to allow him to defend himself against the sheriffs or against anyone else who would be involved. And this is particularly concerning and controversial to people like Samuel Cornish, who don't like the mob anyway. They're thinking that not only is this mob an improper form of politics, but you're breaking all these gender norms by having women out there at the front of the crowd. And what's fascinating to me is that woman, and I'm sure countless other women who were in the crowd, didn't feel like they needed Samuel Cornish to sanction what they were doing. She felt the same concerns that any other Black person felt, the same vulnerability. And maybe, you know, as we know, Black women's experiences of slavery and racism are different. And so she might have felt more intense feelings of vulnerability than someone like William Dixon did. And she wanted to be involved, and she made herself involved. So again, that story doesn't exist as it happened without that woman at the front of the crowd. And so thank you. That's a really critical question.
So I see there are some questions in the chat and think I should step back and let you take over, Patrick, with the questions from the audience.
Certainly. So Professor Cecilia from the Department of History had a question he wanted to articulate instead of type. David, are you there and able to unmute?
Yes, thanks, Patrick. I'm just being a little lazy instead of type this out. So thanks so much, Chris, for your talk and your comments. I'm interested in Garrett Smith's project and
Mhm.
strategy. It sounds very much like Jeffersonian small r republicanism.
Right.
As you know, Jefferson thought that the yeoman farmer was the morally superior person and
Mhm.
the foundation of our democracy, and had the independence through land ownership to be politically independent. And so Hodges goes from being a renter to a landowner.
Mhm.
And, I wonder, so my question is, if you could just talk a little bit about what you saw in writing your book about the role of land ownership in getting access to the vote, because obviously this would be a barrier for most Black folks, right? So
Right.
how did that, what do you think of that strategy, and did it pose a real barrier to a lot of Black folks? Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks for that. I think land ownership posed a profound barrier. I would have to double check on this to be sure, but I'm pretty sure that there weren't other states that passed a sort of property requirement for Black men to vote. Like New York is the one that I have in mind that has this requirement of real estate. Most other states just said Black folks can't vote. So Pennsylvania in 1838, there's a state Supreme Court decision and a state law that deny Black men the right to vote. And that's more of the pattern across the North. So land ownership is a barrier, but it's not a barrier. It's not the main barrier that Black Northerners are confronting. But with that said, the point you make about Garrett Smith and this kind of Jeffersonian ideal, that is actually really prevalent in Black politics from this period, that even if land ownership wasn't the path to the vote, Black activists talked a lot about land ownership as a path to equality, or at the very least, a path to a better life. And so there's this very, the way that I describe it or understand it is that there's a very American kind of thread here in Black politics. It's this idea that, one of the ideas is that Black people, like other Americans, by which they mean like white Americans, Black people should be entitled to the land. And so part of what Black activists are doing is embracing the practices of US imperialism, US continental imperialism, that are connected to native dispossession and the rapid expansion of US residents across the continent. Part of the idea is that, and this is related to Jefferson, also related to Jefferson, because Jefferson was definitely about imperialism. But one of the other ideas here is that land ownership is morally good, that if a person owns land, they will be independent. They won't be beholden to a factory owner who pays their wages. And so they will be a proper or a reliable political participant, because they're not going to be subject to the demands of someone who pays them. Part of the idea is that people should be not reliant on the government for their assistance. And so for Black folks, land ownership was also politically important in this way, because one of the anxieties that white Northern lawmakers expressed about Black people was that if they're free and they come to our state, free Black people are more likely to be poor, and then they will become a burden on the state. And so Black folks would say, well, we're going to go out to Ohio, or we're going to try to settle in the Wisconsin territory. We're going to buy land and set up our own farms, and we will become self-sufficient. And so Black Americans valorized this agrarian ideal in a way that echoed a lot of what Jefferson was saying, and also echoed a lot of the problematic implications of what Jefferson was saying. There's a piece that I just came across recently when I was trying to do some more reading on this point about Black agrarianism, and I think it's from the 1850s. Frederick Douglass was encouraging Black folks to take up farming and saying to move out to the territories. And what I thought was so surprising here was that Douglass contrasted African Americans with Native Americans, and he said that Native Americans were disappearing from the continent, and that they hated the people who had been removing them. And the contrast that Douglass said was that Black Americans understood that they had to sort of find their way into this nation, that they saw themselves as Americans, meaning US residents or US citizens, and that Black people would absolutely not disappear, that they were gonna stick around, and so they better find their way to fit in. And so that's, to me, that's like such a colonialist idea, the trope of the disappearing Indian, the trope of Native people fading away inevitably. That was a thing that white Americans used to allow or to enable their colonialism. And that was an idea that Douglass was using in the 1850s to say, Black folks belong. So he was asserting Black belonging by suggesting that Native Americans didn't belong. So that was a long roundabout way to say there's a lot to this thing about agrarianism and some of its connections to Jefferson and colonialism. Thank you for that.
Thank you. And then there's two questions in the chat. I think you can see both on intellectual history. The first from Mary Seiss in American Studies, sparked by her museum scholarship research seminar on being both a scholar and an activist in academia or in museum settings. And the other from Kevin Aguilar, postdoctoral research fellow in history, about expanding intellectual history beyond the elite and the uncertainty about engaging in formal political spaces such as election and voting due to longstanding histories of Black exclusion. So I'll ask if you might want to tie those all together and speak a little bit more about intellectual history.
Yeah, the lessons we can take from the histories and experiences of individuals such as Willis Hodges to address these current divides on broader collective political projects within the Black community. So I guess I think, so to Mary, to your question, like, how can we think about the sort of relation between scholarship and activism? These questions are related. I guess one of the things that I think about is that the work of a scholar is not work that only needs to take place in an academic space, which is important. And I think, you know, I'm not trained as I could be, and this is part maybe to Kevin's point. I'm not trained as a community organizer. But I understand the training that I have, which is to try to understand the past and to translate and communicate that understanding to audiences. And I feel strongly that understanding, like a thoughtful understanding of American history, should reshape the ways people think about their world. Should help us understand and help us identify injustice and help us think about strategies to confront those injustices. And so one thing that I think is important is recognizing that we all have some skills, and figuring out how exactly, or keeping in mind that those skills can be meaningful beyond the narrow space in which I'm paid to exercise those skills or to deploy those skills. And so, you know, when I go and give a talk at a public library, I feel like I'm equipping people with historical knowledge that should help them understand their world and engage with their world in particular ways. I guess to Kevin's point, I think to Kevin's question, I think is I don't know, maybe a little tougher, but the one of the things that I think about in terms of, like, you know, what lessons we might take from these histories, I think one of the biggest lessons is that people like me, who are formally trained to do intellectual work, should recognize that we're not the only people who are doing intellectual work. That in the same way that the work of an academic doesn't have to be confined to academic spaces, the work of an academic doesn't only come from academic spaces, from people with academic training. And so recognizing, you know, one of the lessons that I think is, like, I don't want to be like Samuel Cornish. Like, I don't want to be a person who is well educated and has the ability to communicate with large audiences in print, and then thinks that other people who don't have those opportunities are thoughtless, or be a person who diminishes the thought work or the cultural work or the political work done by people outside of these spaces. And so I don't know, I guess one of the things that I think is important is Samuel Cornish came from Samuel Cornish's politics suggested that people have to look a particular way to do politics effectively. And one of the things that I think is important is that, and by the same token, I think there are people who do academic work who think academic work has to look a particular way to be meaningful or valuable thought. And one of the things that I think is really important is to challenge the idea that form is the most important thing. Sometimes Black thought looks like Black folks burning down a police station in Minneapolis. And the fact that that form might be shocking doesn't mean that we should dismiss the thought that goes into the burning down of that police station or that target or whatever it might be. And so I guess one of the biggest lessons I think about is to not throw out the politics of the people because it looks different from the politics or the thought that the elite, the intellectual might be engaged in. So I'll stop there.
Great.
That's the end of our questions and I think the end of our time. So Dean, if you want to.
Oh, no, I was just going to thank you, Chris. It's been a fascinating conversation and we really appreciate it. And Patrick, anything you want to say to close us out?
I just want to, again, also say thank you. I was really struck by your writing, both in its, to be frank, the intellectual history and the expansion of intellectual history, but also the engaging way you tell these stories about regular and not so regular people. It was really quite remarkable.
Thanks. Yeah, again, I'm glad to be here. It's always cool to hear questions from folks who are engaging with the work and to think about some of these bigger picture and contemporary connections. So thanks for facilitating the conversation.
Great. And I think in the past, we might ask, Ashley might follow up with you just for a couple of references or something like that we can make available to people but she'll follow up with you and
Yeah.
to let people who are watching know that we can make information available. So thank you very much. And
Great.
Everyone have a good day. Thanks for starting your day with us.
Thank you. Take it easy.